Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who is considered to have one of the most powerful armies in the world, failed in his invasion of Ukraine. This question has been on the agenda ever since Putin began his invasion of Ukraine. This is because the Russian army has suffered huge losses since the beginning of its occupation of Ukraine. So much so that the Russian army has lost nearly 200,000 soldiers and tons of ammunition in its attempt to invade Ukraine. The resistance of the Ukrainian army has spread to the territory of Russia. There were many explosions and fires in Russia. The invasion has turned into a big war, and it seems that Russia will raise the white flag in this war. There are many reasons for the failure of the Russian army. One of the most important of these reasons is undoubtedly the fact that the majority of the army and the population did not know about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. When Russian leader Vladimir Putin drove his tanks into Ukraine's Donbass on February 24, 2022, the invasion officially began. But the vast majority of the army and the population did not learn about the start of the occupation until later. The invasion, which Putin launched for his personal interests and political career, was largely unaccepted by the Russian people and the military. While the public organized continuous protests for an end to the war, the soldiers in the Russian army did not want to take part in the occupation of Ukraine with soldiers who don't want to fight and people who don't support him. Putin, who still hasn't achieved success against Ukraine, is in trouble. While Putin is struggling to continue the occupation with the handful of soldiers he has left his plans to solve, the true problems are failing. Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops at the first opportunity they find. Since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian War, thousands of Russian soldiers have surrendered to Ukrainian troops. So much so that Ukrainian authorities have created a surrender hotline and a surrender mobile app to systematically handle the ever-increasing number of surrenders. This hotline, called I Want to Live, has been called by tens of thousands of Russian soldiers. In addition, the families of Russian soldiers also called the line and received information about the surrender process. Thousands of Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops with the I Want to Live project. So what do the soldiers who surrender to Ukraine do? Russian soldiers who surrendered to Ukrainian troops can continue their lives as they wish. Surrendered soldiers can continue to live in Ukrainian territory or return to their own lands. Some soldiers choose to join the Ukrainian army and fight against Putin. The number of soldiers who left the Russian occupiers and switched sides to fight in the Ukrainian army is increasing every day, so much so that the Russian soldiers who surrendered to Ukraine have formed a group called the Free Russia Legion to fight against the occupying Putin. Hundreds of new Russian soldiers have recently joined the Free Russia Legion. The problems within the Russian army and Putin's occupying attitude is one of the biggest reasons for Russian soldiers to join the Free Russian Legion. After the lack of soldiers and ammunition, the next biggest problem in the Russian army is the factions within the army. The factions within the army caused thousands of soldiers to change sides. The Russian army of the Russian Armed Forces, the Wagner Group, the private mercenary military company, and Kadyrov's Chechens are the main factions within the Russian army. While Wagner Group soldiers do not listen to the commanders of the Russian army of the armed forces, Chechen soldiers are humiliated by both groups because of their beliefs and race. These groupings bring with them many inhumane problems. Russians who do not support Putin's idea of invading Ukraine and want to get rid of the factions within the army have joined the Free Russia Legion. Russian soldiers who do not want to fight against Ukraine ask themselves, "Why am I at war?" He asked the question, and in response preferred to surrender to the Ukrainian troops. The soldiers who surrendered to Ukrainian troops asked themselves the question, "Why am I not fighting against the occupiers?" In answer to this question, they joined the Free Russian Legion. A Russian soldier who joined the Legion explained it in the following words: "I entered this war anyway. I thought I could either die as an occupier and a murderer or die with a clear conscience. So I switched sides. Not wanting to help Putin carry out his inhumane actions, Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian army and formed the Free Russian Legion. In their manifesto, the Legion stated their goals as follows: fighting for a new Russia in liberation from President Vladimir Putin's dictatorial regime. Russian soldiers who want to join the Free Russian Legion go through a very difficult interview process. These interviews are designed to identify Russian occupying soldiers who are spies and want to join the Legion and to test the soldiers' endurance. The soldiers are first subjected to a lie detector test. Those who pass the test are subjected to heavy training. After completing this training, the soldiers are eligible to join the Legion and start fighting against the Russian invaders. Legion members hide their identities as most of their families are in Russia. In the video messages they broadcast, the Legion members hide their faces with masks and hide their identities with pseudonyms. The images shared on social media in recent days have once again revealed the determination of the soldiers in the Free Russian Legion. A masked Russian soldier in the footage said he took risks by joining the Legion, but said he would do anything to fight Putin because Russian leader Vladimir Putin has committed many inhumane and unlawful acts to invade Ukraine. The 25-year-old soldier explained that they were fighting to end Putin's inhumane actors and to have a free Russia. Another Legion member who introduced himself as Professor said, "I realized that there were men like me on the other side. I can't go against my principles. I want my country to be free and democratic." Russian soldiers who changed sides are making a great contribution to the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army receives information about the Russian army's war strategy, important areas where the occupying troops are stationed, and Russian commanders from Russian soldiers who want to switch sides and fight against Putin. As a result of this information, the Ukrainian army carries out successful operations. The Free Russia Legion has carried out many operations since its establishment. The Legion has used many tactics in these operations. One of these tactics was a spectacular tactic. The soldiers of the Legion hung Russian flags on their tanks and entered the area under control of the Russian occupiers. The Legion members gathered detailed intelligence about the Russian invaders in this area and passed the information to the Ukrainian army with the support of the Ukrainian army. The Legion members organized attacks on the occupation points in the region. While the command centers of the occupiers were captured, ammunition depots were blown up. The Russian army is being depleted every day. Although Russian leader Vladimir Putin is developing new measures and strategies every day to prevent its exhaustion, he is not successful. It looks like Putin will soon wave the white flag. Will Putin be able to make up for his setback against Ukraine? What are your thoughts on the Free Russian Legion? Does the Legion have an impact on the course of the war? With the winter months slowly giving way to spring, the Ukrainian war is pregnant with new and harsh clashes. According to experts, these possible new clashes could start in northern Ukraine at the 1,000-kilometer Belarusian border. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been in deep solitude since his army started the Ukrainian family war. Except for a few countries that supported him, he could not justify his war to the world public and was pushed out of the charismatic leader's portrait. Although Russia attacked Ukraine via Belarus in February 2022, it could not convince Belarus to join the war. But the latest claims are that this persuasion effort has concluded. The Ukrainian army destroyed all the crossing bridges on the Belarusian border in order to prevent possible Russian attacks through Belarus. Let's examine the entire infrastructure of the moves that broke the connection between the Russian army and the Belarusian border and the ingenious preparations of Ukraine. Ukrainian officials are increasingly voicing concerns that Moscow may prepare to repeat the February 2022 attack on Kiev, where Russian troops are using Belarus as a launching pad for an attack on the Ukrainian capital. There is no doubt that Russia will attempt another attack on Kiev in the first few months of 2023, but it seems a little improbable for Russia to do so alone. Ukrainian Army intelligence has been working in coordination with Western intelligence units since the beginning of the war. This coordination is clearly visible in the successful offensive operations of the Ukrainian Army on the battlefield again. As a result of this joint coordinated work, the intelligence suggests that Russia will launch an attack to the north of Ukraine via Belarus and open a new front. After this intelligence reached the hands of the Ukrainian Army, the Ukrainian Army increased its defense activities there. So what measures is Ukraine taking for this possible attack? As a result of these activities, the Ukrainian Army is blowing up bridges on the border with Belarus on Mars. It was learned that on the backdrop of a new Russian attack expected by Western countries, including Belarus and Ukraine, Ukrainian troops began to destroy bridges and crossings on the border with Belarus, thus aiming to eliminate the risks of a rapid attack by Russian soldiers, especially in the city of Slavutych. Security measures have increased to a high level. The Ukrainian border cities were already once surrounded by Russian troops, but the brave inhabitants of Slavutych swore not to leave their homes while the Russian army regrouped in Belarus. The area was one of 13 crossing points from Ukraine to the former Soviet Republic until Kiev forces blew up the road bridge, leading to the Kremlin's staunch ally of defense. In recent weeks, Ukraine and Belarus have held military exercises on the 674-mile border in anticipation of a new conflict. The Slavutych Council said locals feared Putin's forces would attack like last year. Slavutych, his first battle took place last March, shortly after the war began. They consider seeing Russians here as a direct danger. The aftermath of the battle for Bucha worries them enough. The Russian army besieged the city for 9 days, cut off electricity and food supplies, and several Ukrainian soldiers were killed. The mayor of Slavutych was kidnapped, then released as thousands of locals protested in the main square. According to the Ukrainian regime and its allies, Russia may be planning another attack from Belarus, putting Slavutych 25,000 inhabitants at the forefront once again. The people of Slavutych have shelters and they can heat places where people can gather. When there is no lighting, heating, internet, everything is ready. People have small packages for an emergency. Everyone understands some families had men in the army and the remaining people began to take up arms. They have great faith in the Ukrainian armed forces and have sworn to fight to the end. Slavutych was built after the 1986 Chernobyl disaster to house plant personnel, their families, and other evacuated residents following the deadly explosion and radioactive leaks at the nuclear power plant. But Sergei Poplogin, head of operations of the Chernobyl security structure, said the risk of nuclear disaster due to war is higher than in 1986. Russian forces captured the Chernobyl exclusion zone and power station on the first day of the war, but were withdrawn last April. Reconnaissance drones fly multiple times a day from Ukrainian positions deep in the dense forest on either side of the border with Belarus, scanning the sky and ground for signs of trouble. On the other side, Ukrainian troops are watching the 650-mile border of swamp and woodland for a possible surprise attack from the north. A repeat of Russia's failed offensive on Kiev at the start of the war nearly a year ago. So how ready are the border troops for a possible attack despite the measures taken? This time, Ukrainians are not taking risks. Since the summer, they have been strengthening the defenses, building and widening trenches in the forest and laying mines in the forest before the spring offensive awaited by the military authorities. Residents of villages in the region that were temporarily occupied last year are horrified at the prospect of things starting up again. The Ukrainian army and the people of the region are listening to every little noise. This is not a lifestyle. They are in constant fear and do not want to live such a life. A month after Russian President Vladimir Putin's rare visit to Minsk, concerns have flared over a military move after Russia and Belarus held joint Air Force exercises. Military experts and Western intelligence underestimated the possibility of a new northern attack. The UK Ministry of Defense said that Russian aircraft and existing Russian troops in Belarus, despite their large numbers, are unlikely to form a credible attack force. Belarusian officials described the deployment of troops along the border as strategic deterrence. The country's authoritarian president, Alexander Lukashenko, insisted that he would not send troops to Ukraine. But Ukrainian commanders are cautious, remembering how Russia used Belarus as a launching pad in early 2022. The head of the region's army intelligence unit said on a press tour this week several miles from the border that they were constantly monitoring the Russian army from the ground, observing the movement of troops, how many soldiers they were moving, and where they were moving them. Unlike the East, with devastating artillery duels here in the North, there is largely a quadcopter warfare. Belarusians and Russians constantly monitor the changing of the guard, trying to find the positions of the Ukrainian army, but they still have not come to a conclusion. From time to time, army intelligence detects Russian reconnaissance drones and shoots them against the drone with rifles, or a Russian drone detects a Ukrainian one and follows him, at which point the Ukrainians try to capture him and add to their stockpiles. They recently bought 4 of their Russian drones this way and lost 2 of their own drones. Exploration missions are yet to show any alarming signs of activity. The reinforcement division exists and the patrol has been strengthened, but they do not observe a significant troop buildup in their division. Ukrainian officials claim that no one knows how Moscow will act in the coming months and that a state of alert should be raised along the border. Fortifications on the Belarusian border were built to prevent infiltration. Border troops should always be ready, with or without such an infiltration, armed with machine guns. Ukrainian soldiers stand in trenches dug into the forest floor and reinforced with planks 5 feet deep. But despite the Russian-Belarusian exercises, there is hope. When Russia first came to the northern territory of Ukraine, they did not have weapons and armies on the border. But this time all precautions seem to have been taken. For Putin, forcing Belarus to join the war would be a desperate gamble that could easily backfire. It has already suffered disastrous losses in Ukraine and cannot afford another humiliating military defeat. However, as Putin's war plans rapidly deteriorate and his options narrow, he may decide that involving Belarus in the war is worth the risk. There are a lot of developments in the east. Here, Russian forces concentrated their efforts on expanding the buffer zone to the north of Bakhmut to protect their flanks in the face of the imminent Ukrainian counteroffensive. They started pushing along the highway and even got notable results. But because they got too far from their defense and were operating on a very narrow front, Russian losses have doubled and continue to stay at more than 1,000 killed per day. Last time I told you that one of the main axes of Ukrainian counterattack was recently revealed by Russians because the concentration of Ukrainian forces in Mankivka and neighboring settlements has substantially increased. I also told you that in response to this development, Wagner's focus more than a third of their forces on this 5-kilometer front line in order to create a buffer zone as fast as possible. The freshest reports provided by the Ukrainian spokesman of the Eastern Group of Forces noted that the intensity of fights around increased even more after establishing control over Dubovo-Vasilivka. Russian forces struggled to move directly to Orhovo-Vasilyevka because of a natural barrier in the form of another hill. Russian forces shifted their fire on the Ukrainian strongpoint near the highway, and after they breached it, they could approach Ukrainian positions on this hill along the tree lines. Such a development exposed Ukrainian positions in Orikho-Vasilivka, and according to Russian sources, Ukrainians had to retreat from 2 checkpoints inside the village out of 4 due to the overwhelming crossfire. The main goal of the Russians is to get to Minivka, exactly where Ukrainians have their forces concentrations. The idea here is to start attacking them before they launch a counterattack. This way, Ukrainians will get entangled in positional fights, which will complicate offensive actions significantly. The second thing Wagners are doing is trying to breach the most fortified area inside Bakhmut, the ASM industrial area. Some sources reported that Wagners have already entered the northern part of the industrial area. However, Reports with recently made geolocated footage only confirm that Russians maintain positions no closer than 800 meters from this complex. The main idea of attacking the most formidable defenses is that if Wagner somehow managed to breach it, then Bakhmut will fall very rapidly and there would be no point in making this massive counterattack. But such a risky and aggressive approach comes at a great cost. Since Wagner forces launched this highly attritional westward expansion, Russian losses have spiked once again. And if last week Russians were losing approximately 600 soldiers, then over the last 3 days, Russians are losing almost twice as many soldiers. Russian sources reported that Wagner's advances are constrained by artillery and mortar strikes as well as air strikes because Wagners are advancing along the very narrow line to the north of Bakhmut. Ukrainians are engaging their artillery units not only from Konstantinovka, but also Siversk. Ukrainian mortar units are shelling Russians from safe positions behind the canal in Novomarkovo. Advancement along such a narrow line also means that Russians are getting too far from their air defense, which makes them vulnerable to air strikes. Yesterday, it was confirmed that Ukrainians are freely engaging up to 6 fighter jets to bomb Russian strongpoints. Today it was also reported that 3 helicopter gunships are operating at low altitudes for the long-running battle for Bakhmut. With that in mind, the spike in Russian losses is not surprising. In order to compensate for such levels of losses, the head of Wagner Group, Prigozhin, doubled down on expanding recruitment efforts in Russia. At first, they were opening recruitment centers at sport clubs. But lately, Wagner Group has also started focusing on youth. Wagner Group has recently opened 6 recruitment centers in schools. Russian Ministry of Education in Apatite included Wagner personnel at a career guidance lesson to tell heroic stories and promote the service in the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group likely aims to recruit more impressionable recruits through this youth-focused campaigns and instill in them Prigozhin's extreme ideology. Some Russian officials are even advertising contract service in unusual places. For example, it was recently revealed that a Moscow-based psychiatrist is calling on suicidal men to join army and die for a good cause. Overall, Wagner forces are trained to cancel the Ukrainian counteroffensive at any cost. Prigozhin understands that right now, the success of his 7-month-long campaign is at stake, and no matter the losses, he must somehow prevent it. Many analysts are saying that Ukrainians will likely launch their counteroffensive on Monday or Tuesday. However, Ukrainians are still controlling their positions on the biggest hill in the area, which does not allow Wagners to even clear the village. So Ukrainians should still have a little time to wait for the ground to dry up in order to increase the chances of their success.